Hi guys, chapter 6. I've got something to sell you. You're going to love it, I swear. You're going to absolutely love what I'm about to sell you. Alright, I've got something to ensure that you will never be sick again. And God forbid if you do get sick, use this, gone. Get the flu, no issues. God forbid you contract Zika virus, no issues. My friends, it's called the Carbolic Smoke Ball. Alright, and it can do everything for you. And if you pay me for it, I guarantee you, there's a money-back guarantee with this. If you actually purchase this Carbolic Smoke Ball for me, I will give you back, get this, even though it's not worth as much as it was the other day because of the self-called Brexit, I will give you 50 British pounds. That's right. How many people here would like to buy my Carbolic Smoke Ball? Now guys, we're going to talk about the Carbolic Smoke Ball on page 123, but it's funny because I asked my students that last semester here at SMU, and believe it or not, I had about a dozen hands go up of people who actually took me seriously, that there was this cure-all for anything and everything. We're going to learn about the Carbolic Smoke Ball, which actually was a case from 1893 in the United Kingdom. We'll get into that a little later. Right now, we are getting down to the basic elements of a contract, all right? And you're going to start seeing that on page 111. We're going to get into acceptance. We're going to have offer, we're going to have acceptance, and then we're going to have consideration. You'll see right there, middle of page 111, we see an offer. It's a promise to perform specific acts on certain terms. That's what it is. You'll see they give you an example in the negotiations between the person we introduced in chapter 5 and Jason Hughes, who's a representative of another company called Trackers. So you have coasters trying to do business with Trackers. And they provide to you in the book what those negotiations involve and what the offer necessarily entails. You need to make sure that there's certainty of offer. It can't be necessarily a conditional offer, although there is at least one notable exception to that we'll discuss later. There has to be certainty to the offer. We will offer you this in return for this. There has to be clearness. There has to be certainty. There has to be complete clarity as to what type of deal that you'll potentially be making. An invitation to treat is not, repeat, is not an offer. It's an expression of willingness to do business. All right, so they give you the offer, they give you the example here of when Amritha provided Jason with plans for the roller coaster. She was not offering to buy tracking from Jason at that point, but merely indicating that she had an interest in receiving an offer from him. They give you another example, though, a couple of paragraphs down, when we're dealing with retail outlets who are trying to attract new customers to their stores. They do the advertising as well as describing products they sell and the prices they charge, especially when the prices have been reduced. These advertisements are not seen as being offers. You know, back where I come from, we have something called Black Friday, all right? It's the day after the U.S. Thanksgiving, and many of you have probably heard of it, where a bunch of people are huddled outside of a Best Buy or a Walmart or some other retail outlet at 2, 3 a.m. trying to take advantage of, a typical Best Buy one would be something along the lines of, hey, here's a 60-inch television for an ungodly low price, perhaps $400. All right? And people will sit out there in the hopes that they're going to be able to buy a TV for that cheap on Black Friday once those doors come open. And Best Buy has gotten good a bit about at least having a little star there, a little asterisk, saying that there are only limited quantities at each store. Now, what a limited quantity is anyone's guess. It could be all of one or two. But at least that covers them. There's no contract. Best Buy is not obligated to actually sell you a 60-inch television for $400. It's not. An advertisement is an advertisement. You cannot sue Best Buy because you showed up to actually sit out there and spend your time trying to get one of those things. Now, again, I could probably create a set of facts, and I probably will for you, where something that might be an invitation to treat, or there may be enough facts where it actually rises beyond that, and maybe to the level of being an offer that you have accepted, where consideration will be changing hands. It would be a contract. Well, we'll discuss that later on, all right? You'll see on page 113 that there is something called a standard form contract that's mentioned. A standard form contract is a take it or leave it contract where the customer agrees to a standard set of terms that favors the other side. Under what circumstance? Your cell phone contract. I guarantee you that everybody sitting out there right now probably has a cell phone. Did you actually get to negotiate the terms of your contract with your cell phone company? The answer is what? No, you did not. It's a standard contract. Every one of you who has a Facebook account right now, did you actually get to negotiate with Facebook to determine what information Facebook can gather before you agreed to actually set up an account on Facebook? The answer is what? Of course not. You accepted the terms in order to have Facebook, and if you didn't want to, you don't have to go on Facebook. Or you don't have to remain on Facebook if the terms become something that you no longer desire and actually abiding by. You'll see at the very bottom, and it's just something that should be mentioned in passing on page 113, this notion of spamming, all right? It's obviously there's no contract created there. It's nothing more than normally unwanted commercial goods that hit your inbox. It could be part of a scam, but notwithstanding, is there any type of contract that's created there? The answer is no. Although certainly the government of Canada and other countries take spamming seriously to the point where there's legislation that specifically prohibits that type of communication to potential customers. Page 116, we talk about termination of an offer. How long does an offer stay alive? I mean, if the offer just sits out there, if I offer to buy your computer for $20 and you don't respond to me at all, you just let it sit out there, what happens? Can you come back a year later and say, hey, I'm accepting your offer, please buy my computer for $20? Well, that's not normally what can happen. It depends upon the context of the particular offer and the timing of the acceptance. But you'll see in the bullet points on page 116, an offer can be terminated or taken off the table by any of the following events. Revocation, meaning I could say, my offer is rescinded, my offer is taken back, you haven't accepted, it's no longer out there, or you can put a term in to the original offer. This is my offer, but it is only good for the next 24 hours. 24 hours later, it's automatically revoked. And that's also called lapsing. Since I have put a time period on your ability to accept, once that 24 hours expires, it is a lapse of time. You can't come back after 25 hours or even 24 hours, 1 minute and say, I accept. The time period to accept has officially lapsed. It's gone. Rejection. If you look at me when I offer you $20 for your fine laptop computer, you look at me and you say, yeah, right, that's not happening. That's your rejection. Now, you can always counteroffer, as we'll discuss. The counteroffer is a new offer. If you say to me instead, I will give you my computer, sell you my computer for $200, you're now making the offer as opposed to me. And it's my decision as to whether or not to accept your counteroffer. But in the case that we're discussing here, we're talking about your rejection. We've talked about counteroffer, and then we go into how else it can lapse. And it's an interesting thing. If there's an offer made, but there has been a death on the part of the offeror, the person making the offer, or the person who is making the offer has either gone insane or was insane at the time of the offer, then the offer would immediately lapse. It would be taken off the table because it was no longer valid. So we've discussed revocation, and you'll see that on pages 116 and 117. Please pay attention to the landmark case on page 118, Dickinson v. Dodds. It will be ripe for testing. And then we get into what I talked about before, or at least I alluded to before, an option agreement. Because it's not necessarily a true offer with certainty, it's potential. So pretend that you are living in a house right now that you're renting. And somewhere within your rental agreement, there is an option to buy. All right? There's nothing out there, it's an offer, certainly. But there is no necessary obligation to actually buy that unless you accept the option to buy under the terms that are offered in there. The option to buy is unique because it only goes into effect normally, especially in the instance that I gave you, at the end of the normal contract that you've already entered into. So if you've rented your house for a year and you have an option to buy, the option doesn't take effect until probably shortly before your lease period, your rental period expires, ends. At that point, you have the ability to exercise your option. You have the ability to accept at that point to accept what the person is asking. Now, you're under no obligation at the same time to accept, even though an option may be part of a greater contract with other terms where you've already had a meeting of the minds. There's already offer, there's already acceptance, there's already consideration. An option is sort of an offer within a pre-existing contract. Whether you choose to accept it or not, that's there. And it's not going to go away because that's going to be there for you to accept or reject. It's not going to be rescinded because it can't be rescinded by the person who made the offer option, because that's seen as, at least the notion of the option is seen as being part of the previous contract. So, you decide that you want to buy your house, and there's an option to buy the house that you've been renting. You can do that then. You can accept. Once it's accepted, you're also accepting under the terms that accompany the option, because in all likelihood, that same option is also going to involve a set amount that for you to purchase the home, or at least gives you the opportunity to negotiate a fair market value price for your home. Page 119. One other thing is revocation based upon a tendering of a contract. Oftentimes, especially when you're dealing with possible government contracts, the government will release what's called a tender. It will seek out various types of offers from various potential companies that it could do business with, or individuals that it could do business with. The tendering itself does not in any way constitute offer and acceptance. In fact, it's not an offer. It's seen as being preliminary, according to the materials on page 119. So your tender doesn't necessarily mean anything. Your tender, it will likely be with many other tenders that the government would have to consider in order to be able to determine, okay, which tender do we ultimately want to accept? Which tender best suits our requirements for anything. It could be cell phone service. It could be for purposes of designing a garden out at Halifax City Commons. It could be any variety of things. It could also involve private businesses seeking out tenders from subcontractors. So it doesn't have to necessarily always be about a public tendering process. It could also be a private tendering process. But guys, it's not a contract. It's seen as being, as the book states here, a preliminary contract. And that's all it is. And a preliminary contract is not a contract. It's not an invitation to treat either, according to the case law. We discussed lapse. You'll see the definition of that on page 119. We've discussed refusal or rejection. We come to page 120. We've also touched upon counteroffer, and we've also touched upon death or insanity. The next thing we come to is the second major element of contracts, acceptance. You'll see the definition there on the left-hand bar. An unqualified willingness to enter into a contract on the terms in the offer. And you think, okay, that's easy. Offer, acceptance, what's so big? Because it's not always clear. What is an acceptance? Just as we saw with an offer, it's a little bit more complicated than just saying, hey, I'll buy your computer for $20 and you saying no or saying yes. There's such complexity, it's boundless. And that's something that you're going to have to understand, and this was what these chapters are designed to provide to you, that good basic understanding of all of the complexities that you may have to, in all likelihood will have to, undertake once you go out into the business world. Page 120, we deal with this notion of what is a communication of acceptance. When is acceptance good is also going to be an issue that's going to be arising here. But in terms of legal acceptance, you have to communicate. The offeree, the person who received the offer, must communicate by words or conduct an unconditional assent to the offer in its entirety. If you say to me, you know what, I will sell it to you for $20, but also if you give me that radical watch, that's essentially a rejection of my offer. You're now submitting a counter offer to me. So it's not about that. You have to agree to the entirety of the offer. They give you a good example there right out of Nova Scotia. And again, that's the beauty of this book. You get a lot of Nova Scotia examples, whereas most books, the cases that you see are coming mostly out of Ontario. But Lowe v. Upper Clements Family Theme Park is located there. Please review that. The best example I can give you, though, is about, remember, our carbolic smoke ball. You'll see on page 123, Carlisle v. Carbolic Smoke Ball Company. All right, there is, let's go over the facts. Okay, this is late 19th century England, where you have a lot of miracle cures being offered. We used to also call them snake oil charmers, where they try to sell you something that is designed to prevent anything and everything. This is involving the legal obligations of an advertisement that's placed by the Carbolic Smoke Ball Company in a London newspaper. You'll see that in figure 6.2. And you'll see that from the advertisement that if you use this 3 times daily, for 2 weeks, according to the printed directions supplied with each ball, and it doesn't work and you get the flu anyway, they will pay the amount of 1,000 pounds. It's a lot of money, especially back 120 some years ago. It's a huge amount of money, in fact. Today it would probably be along the lines of, I would have to hazard a guess and say somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000. So, guess what happens? Mrs. Carlisle used the smoke ball as directed for 2 weeks and got the flu. Big surprise. She's inhaling toxic fumes out of a smoke ball. That doesn't prevent the flu. The legal question was, is there a contract between the parties? Because she went to the company and said, hey, pay up. I caught the flu. They said, no, that's not the case. The Carbolic Smoke Ball Company's position in this case was, well, they didn't know that Ms. Carlisle had accepted. We don't even necessarily know where she got the smoke ball. It's not the modern day where hopefully you keep a little receipt that says, hey, this is what I purchased. So they said, well, if she was accepting this offer to challenge us to pay her 1,000 pounds, she should have told us that she was actually going to undergo this, and then we would be responsible. It's not enough for her to actually just buy the smoke ball. She had to literally communicate the acceptance. So the question here is by purchasing and using this carbolic smoke ball, does that constitute actual acceptance? And you'll see here that while communication of acceptance is generally required, that's not always the case. When the Carbolic Smoke Ball Company had chosen to dispense with the necessity of notice, it could not complain about Ms. Carlisle's failure to communicate acceptance now. In the end, the court found that Ms. Carlisle had accepted the company's offer of reward by using the smoke ball as requested, and that upon becoming sick, she was contractually entitled to the 1,000 pounds. It was 100 pounds, guys. Man, I apologize. There is a mistake in the book where it says 1,000 pounds down below. It's actually 100 pounds. So she was entitled to the 100 pounds, which again would still be a significant amount, probably along the lines of, I would have to guess, in nowadays about $5,000. Did Carbolic Smoke Ball Company want to pay that amount? Absolutely not. But you know what? It's like anything else. This is the advertisement. The advertisement doesn't put any requirement that you have to communicate that you are going to be doing this before you can actually avail yourself of our offer, of our challenge. So Ms. Carlisle, as a result, quite rightfully won. You'll see here in the critical analysis on page 123 that this is a classic example of a unilateral contract. The court didn't identify it as a unilateral contract, but it nonetheless constitutes one where only the offer is bound because the offeree performs the requested act. That is called a unilateral contract. And you get it normally in these types of consumer-based product relationships. I am going to take this, I am going to use it as directed, and I anticipate that it is going to work well for me. If I take an over-the-counter prescription drug designed to prevent sinus infection and it doesn't work, I have performed on that unilateral contract. I have accepted it by buying it, I have performed on it. If it does not work, would I not at the very least be entitled to my money back? And the answer is what? Yes. Now, one thing that we also deal with is how you communicate acceptance and when it becomes valid. And we used to have something called the mailbox rule. We still do. If there is an offer is good once it has been received by the offeree, the person to whom it is conveyed. When is an acceptance actually deemed valid? Under the mailbox rule, as soon as the person accepting or rejecting puts the envelope back into the mail slot, that's when the acceptance or the rejection is deemed valid. Meaning that the person making the offer doesn't actually have to receive it. So long as it has been sent and is within that chain, that flow within Canada Post or some other provider, it is deemed to be accepted. So there's the distinction. An offer is only valid once it is actually received, once it has actually arrived at the person or the company to which it's being offered. But the acceptance or the rejection is deemed valid as soon as that acceptance is dropped into the mail. Doesn't need to be received by the offeror. Now, of course, in the electronic age, things have changed a bit. All right? And we don't necessarily have to worry as much about when something is sent or when it's received, because if we're talking in terms of faxes, and especially now if we're talking in terms of emails, generally speaking, an acceptance is easy. There is no timeline where you have to wait 1, 2, 3 or more days for a letter to get to the person making the offer. With an email acceptance, it's just, I accept the terms of the contract, send. And it's there almost instantaneously. So the terms of offer and acceptance and the communication of acceptance have changed over the last 25 years. Radically changed. You'll see specifically when we're dealing with, in Canada we have, page 125, the Uniform Electronic Commerce Act, that gives you some notion of when you're dealing in commerce, what constitutes offer, what constitutes acceptance, what constitutes the necessary rules in order for electronic acceptance to actually occur. Page 128. On page 128, we're dealing with that third fundamental element, that third really important element of a contract. It's consideration. What price you're paying for the promise to offer you a good or a service. If it's something where there is no consideration, then it's not a legally enforceable contract. Instead, it's simply a gratuitous promise. You may remember the instance from earlier. If I take off my watch and I offer it to the gentleman filming me right now, and I say, "Here, would you like this?" And he says, "Oh yes, it's a very nice watch." And then I walk toward him and say, "Psych, I was just kidding." Can he enforce that? The answer is no. Because what I was doing was simply giving him a gratuitous promise, a gratuity. There's no obligation, it's a gift. Now, as much as maybe some of you work at restaurants as servers, or certainly I would say the vast majority of you have been to a restaurant where you have been served by somebody, are you required to pay them a tip? Are you required to give them what's otherwise called a gratuity? And the answer is what? The answer is no. If they've given you good service, you should, but it's a gratuity. It's optional. All right, there's no entitlement. The server who's serving you, if you end up bilking them out of a tip, they can't come back, sue you in small claims court for 15 or 20% of the actual bill. There is zero obligation for you to actually pay that tip. It's something that's seen as being nice. It's something that's being seen as standard and acceptable in society, but it's nothing that constitutes a contract. There's no legal requirement. Now you do, at the same time, with the restaurant, you do have a contract. If you sit down there and you order food and you consume that food, then normally you're under an obligation to pay for that food. That is a contract, and there is a legal obligation that can be enforced, both under civil law, as well, both civilly, as well as even under criminal law for defrauding an innkeeper for not actually paying for something that you should otherwise have paid for. All right, what happens if you have a pre-existing legal duty? It's an issue that comes up. You'll see it starting on the page 129. If there's a pre-existing legal duty, can you claim that there is some type of contract? I'll give you an example. Say that you're in a situation where somebody has snatched your purse or taken your wallet, and you run up to a cop and you say to the cop, please help me. Please catch that person right now. They're running down the street. If you catch them, I will give you $250. Is there some contractual basis for you to ever pay the police officer the $250 even if they do catch the thief? And the answer is what? No. No, because the police officer is under a pre-existing legal duty. That's his or her job. That's what they're affecting. You can't say to the firefighter who shows up at your burning house, please, do whatever you do, just save that collection of jewelry from my mother and my grandmother. It means so much to me. If you do, I will make sure that I give you 1/2 the value of that jewelry, which may be $5,000, $10,000. The jewelry is saved. Is it something where you have to give a reward to that firefighter? And the answer is no. There is no contractual obligation on your part to do that. This is their duty. They have a legal duty to render the service that you're requesting. Maybe not necessarily saving your jewelry, but you get the general gist of things. We talk about variation of contracts on page 130. Say that you have a contract, and say that you want to tweak the contract, you want to vary it a bit. Okay, does that have to be met with fresh consideration? Generally speaking, the courts in Canada say no. All right, so long as it's varied, the pre-existing consideration is going to be fine for that varied contract. So long as it is not secured by something we'll discuss later called duress, economic duress. You can't actually put out there a new contract where you know that all of a sudden this variance is because of unequal bargaining power now between the two parties that originally contracted. And again, we'll get into this notion of duress a bit later on. We see on page 131, promises enforceable without consideration. All right, there's something called a promise under seal, which is normally not used anymore, but you can see an example of that on page 132. And we see this notion of what's called promissory estoppel. Guys, one of the top 5 topics, I would say, that's important for purposes of you understanding contract law is the notion of promissory estoppel. Somebody who relies on a gratuitous promise may be able to enforce it. Okay? If you relied on it to your detriment, and it was a reasonable reliance, then that constitutes something that is enforceable in court. So say, for instance, that you have a situation where someone says, listen, if you wait to actually purchase this stock, shares in this stock, if you wait for a little while, I will help to finance it for you. I will give you 1/2 the purchase price for that stock. If you wait and all of a sudden, in the period that you waited, the stock value then dramatically increases in value, you still want it, or maybe you don't want it, but you've lost out on the money that you otherwise would have gotten, that you would have gained, the profit you would have gained by actually waiting. Could you reasonably have relied upon the person's promise if that by waiting they would help to foot half the bill? And the answer is maybe. Depends on who actually gave that. If it was Bill Gates who actually made that promise to you, well, you know that Bill Gates actually has the ability to be able to pay a certain amount of money to you in order to make your waiting worthwhile. Now, at the same time, if the promise is made to you by a friend who's always down and out, never has any money, and yet they're asking you to actually wait before you actually purchase shares in that company, is that considered reasonable reliance? And the answer would, in all likelihood, be no. It's not. Promissory estoppel. Effectively, if somebody makes a promise to you, and you reasonably rely on that promise to your detriment, then the law will help you enforce that promise anyway. It's saying that a promise that has been made and it's stopped from actually being reneged upon because you were damaged by it. Promissory estoppel, guys. You'll see a good example of it from the hypothetical with coasters on page 133. Read over that paragraph carefully, including the bullet points, because it will provide you with the example that you need to hopefully better understand this very important concept of promissory estoppel. Partial payment of a debt, bottom of page 133. What happens if a customer cannot pay on an account and wants to settle for the smaller amount? Is that suitable? Is that legally enforceable? And the answer is what? Well, yes. It's a creditor's promise. If a creditor chooses to accept one half of your debt, of your credit card debt, so that it wipes off the rest of the debt, that's seen as being an actual contract. That's seen as being an actual bargain. What does the creditor get? The creditor gets one half of its debt. What do you get? You get the rest of the debt wiped off. The creditor that promise can be enforced in court. If a creditor then goes to court and tries to claim the other half of what you otherwise owe to it, will the promise to pay the 50% hold up in court? The answer is probably yes. The chapter goes into toward the bottom of page 134 and into the top of page 135. The intention to contract gets into also family agreements. Within business agreements, the most important aspect is going to be this notion of rebuttable presumptions. Was there an intention to contract? If one party is making the allegation that there was a contract and there was an intention to contract, then there is a rebuttable presumption, meaning that the intention will be assumed unless it is otherwise rebutted. And you'll see the definition of rebuttable presumption in the right-hand bar on page 135. Guys, that's it. That's it for chapter 6. All right? Again, this provided you with the basic elements of what constitutes a contract. And I'm going to say it again, all right? Offer, acceptance, consideration. In chapter 7, we're now going to be dealing with the terms of a contract, what I call the nitty-gritty of a contract. Because oftentimes, any contract is not as simple of, I will pay you $400 for that new cell phone. Okay, here's $400, there's my new cell phone, that's it. It's normally, especially in the business world, not that simple. We'll get into that in chapter 7.